Good morning, everyone. December 17th, 1950, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton is leading Baker flight, a flight of 4 F-86As into an area that will become known as MiG Alley. It's the first time that the F-86 has arrived in the Korean theater. At 25,000 feet, Baker 2 calls out bogeys left 10 o'clock low. He's calling out unknown aircraft crossing left to right about 7,000 feet below. Colonel Hinton calls for Baker flight to drop tanks, jettison their external tanks, and commences what will become about a 5G turn onto the bogeys, which they can tell are also swept-wing jets. They're MiGs. This is the first time that the F-86 and the MiG-15 will meet in air-to-air combat. Of course, it won't be the last, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to talk about the aircraft, how they were developed, the relative differences and similarities. We're going to talk about the pilots. We're going to talk about the environment that they went into, because for the next 32 months after that first meeting, they will continue to fight each other in the skies over North Korea. We'll talk a little about the results and some of the revision of some of that history with new facts. And we'll talk a little bit about the legacy of this first jet-to-jet air combat at the beginning of the Cold War. But the story of the F-86 and the MiG-15 actually begins in Germany. As you know, Germans had a thriving aircraft industry, and the two main manufacturers of fighter aircraft in Germany were Focke-Wulf, which was primarily based out of Bremen and Marienburg in the north part of Germany, and Messerschmitt, whose largest factory was in Regensburg. As you know, the Allies will hit both of these areas very heavily. If you watch Masters of the Air, you'll see the number of missions that went into Germany and the incredible losses that we took trying to take out the fighter industry. Both Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt, Bremen and Regensburg were bombed multiple times. The Minister of Aviation under Nazi Germany, Edvard Milch, he ordered the increase of fighter production to 1,000 aircraft per month. They actually achieved a peak of 1,200 fighter aircraft per month. Focke-Wulf, during the war, actually produced 20,000 FW-190s, to give you an idea of the scope of German industry. But even after all the bombing, which was extensive, and which we took heavy losses for, to the point where after the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, we took over 20% losses. It's over 30% if you count the aircraft that we lost due to maintenance in North Africa. With that type of continued effort, it was statistically impossible for a bomber crew to make 25 missions for Germany. Pretty sobering. Masters of the Air covers this really well in their series. That is the Messerschmitt plant down near Regensburg and the devastation. So even though it didn't achieve the results that the Allies wanted, the Germans did react to these bombing raids. And they diversified the industry. They moved the production to different sites. They also went underground in some cases, and they moved south and east. In the case of Focke-Wulf, they moved southeast, closer to the eastern border of Germany. And in the case of Messerschmitt, they moved south into the Bavarian area down by Munich and into Austria. Also, as you know, when the Allies went into Germany, the Russians came in from the east, and we came in from the north and the west. So the Russians were able to get into the Focke-Wulf plant faster, and we were primarily driven by what we saw with Messerschmitt. So why is any of this important? As you know, during World War II, the German aircraft industry had their first operational jet fighter, the Me-262. They also had the first operational rocket powered fighter, the Me-163. The ME-162 was first flown in 1942, but fortunately for us, they didn't use it very effectively, even though they had a squadron of experts that flew this airplane. Why is this important? We'll just do a comparison between arguably our best Allied fighter in World War II, the P-51D, and the ME-262. A couple things stand out here. You can see the difference in just top speed, incredibly important in air-to-air combat. And if you listen to Steve Church's talk on Thursday, he'll tell you that speed and firepower were more important than maneuverability and fighter design during World War II and today. Rate of climb, obviously, significantly better. And you'll notice that you pay a penalty for that, and that penalty would be range. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the Allies saw this. They said, we've got to have this technology, and we don't have it now. The US was lagging behind the British in developing jet engines. We had a design, but it really couldn't beat the piston-driven fighters of the age. The Bell P-59 Air Cobra wasn't as good as our piston-driven fighters. And the British were kind of in the same area, although they had excellent jet engine technology that only got better. So everybody leaned towards the Germans because they were so far ahead. And it didn't always work out for the ME-262. I just thought I'd throw the shot in. Here's an ME-262 taking a shot on a P-51 taken from another P-51 who shot it down. But you can see with the different markings here that everybody got their hands on ME-262s after the war as they went into Germany from different sides. We especially wanted the aerodynamic and the engine technology. And we took a really good reverse engineering effort here to try and come up with it. So for the US, we had already come up with a successful prototype with the Lockheed P-80, which we first flew in 1944. And we had the development, and that was from Lockheed. From North American, we had development of a similar fighter with a slightly different engine, General Electric engines, that was coming out towards the end of the war. But North American had an idea, some excellent engineers, and they said, German aerodynamic tests and some of the designs that they came up with, both the Messerschmitt and a Focke-Wulf, showed that if you did a wing sweep of 35 degrees, we could avoid some of the transonic region problems that you have with a straight wing aircraft. And so they came up with what they call the XP-86, and you can see the difference here. This is the same basic airframe, which became the Navy's first operational jet fighter, the FJ-1 Fury, on the left. And on the right, you can see basically the same airframe, but the wings are swept back 35 degrees, and the tailplane 35 degrees as well. And the horizontal stabilizer about 10 degrees of dihedral. This design, they felt, could meet the Air Force requirement for a fighter interceptor, which was 600 miles an hour. And it would be able to hit the transonic region, although it wasn't designed to go supersonic. The XP-86, first flight, October 1st, 1947. The test pilot was George Wheaties Welch, and he was an ace in World War II. He was the pilot on December 7th, 1941, who shot down 4 Japanese planes with a P-40. Same guy. Interesting character. He saw the indications on the first flight when he did a high-speed dive that indicated that he may have exceeded the speed of sound. Chase pilot didn't think so. Bob Hoover. So whose word are you going to take? But he definitely got close, and the aircraft seemed to be very stable through about 0.96 Mach. And we'll talk a little bit more about Mach number in a minute. But it definitely was the airplane that the Air Force was looking for. So we wanted to go into production as soon as possible. It was a slightly different Air Force in that day. The Air Force had just become an independent service 1 month prior, and the people running the Air Force decided that the Air Force is going to get more of the budget if we can maximize the nuclear bomber fleet at the expense of everything else, including fighters, and that will keep America and the world safe in the future. That was the byline at the time. Well, the Russians were busy too. And on the upper left, you see the Yak-15. This is basically a piston engine airplane that they put a ME-262 engine in and see if it would fly, and it seemed to. It was a little unstable at high speed. They also put a second cockpit into it and made it into a jet trainer. But it was their first attempt at a jet fighter. On the upper right, you see the MiG-9, which is a little bit better design with an improved engine. And there's a little story on the engines here. I mentioned that the English, the Brits, had Rolls-Royce, they call it the Neem engine. It was it was probably the best jet engine at the time that we had. So we had a change in government after Winston Churchill left office, and they decided, the Russians made a direct overture and said, we'd like to buy a bunch of these engines from you, these new advanced jet engines. And the Labour government decided that they would sell them 50, but they could only use them for peaceful purposes. Russians took that deal, reverse engineered it, and that engine went into the MiG-9. Peacefully. And they also said that they actually designed that engine on their own. Not the first time they made that kind of statement. And the lower left, that looks a lot like a MiG-15, does it not? That is actually a Focke-Wulf design called the Hackbein, and they came up with that design in 1945. It was to be a single-engine jet fighter with swept wings that would be capable of entering transonic region. So they borrowed the aerodynamic and the engine technology to try and get a jump on the west. And they also wanted an interceptor that could shoot down all those strategic bombers that were going to be flying all over the world, ready to rain bombs down on them. On the lower right, I included this because this is another competitor with the MiG-15, the Lavochkin, and it was capable of supersonic flight. It was actually a pretty good airplane, but it was going to be more expensive to produce, and the Russians, if nothing else, they valued utility, perhaps over technology, so they went with the MiG-15 design from Mikoyan and Gurevich versus the Lavochkin design. But it seemed to be a pretty good airplane, and test pilots seemed to think it was superior. So the MiG-15, interestingly enough, a MiG-15 flew 3 months after, actually 2 months after the F-86 first flight. So they are definitely contemporaries. Not only do they look alike, the performance is very similar. The requirement for the VVS, the Soviet Air Force at the time, was 621 miles an hour, and they were able to achieve it with the first MiG-15. It was a little bit crude, and they revised it, and they came up with a MiG-15 BIS model, which was a little bit better. Still had some issues, but it was definitely capable. And so we talked about both these airplanes. How do they look side by side? So you can see some differences here. You have a little bit better thrust to weight on a MiG-15. That becomes very obvious. Airplane's lighter, it's a little bit smaller. The design is very similar. The MiG-15 has a T-tail versus the mid-tail for the horizontal stabilizer. The MiG-15 also, because of the lightweight, it has a higher rate of climb, and it's more powerful in terms of armament. So Focke-Wulf was definitely in favor, and the Germans in general were in favor of using cannons versus machine guns as primary armament. And particularly when you're trying to shoot down a bomber, it felt like a cannon was necessary. It was true for the P-38 in World War II as well, using a 20 millimeter designed to shoot down a bomber. Fighter-fighter combat may be a little bit different So that was their armament. So they used two 23 millimeters and a 30 millimeter cannon in the MiG-15. The F-86 went basically with World War II armament, 650s, and off we go. You see that the MiG-15 has slightly shorter range, and that's because of the thrust to weight and the penalty that you pay for that. Okay, MiG-15 cockpit. And you can see some interesting things here. That large, it's sort of a face pad there. That's in case you have a violent, when the aircraft goes transonic, sometimes you get a violent pitch up. So instead of fixing that problem, Russians installed sort of a headrest. I mean, there's a lot of things you can laugh at with Russian technology, but there's actually some very practical considerations in how they build aircraft. They may look crude, but it's because of some of the environments they have to operate in. So I think it's funny too. The other thing I think it's funny, you will see in every Russian fighter aircraft, and probably before the MiG-15, you can't really see it that well in this picture, but right behind the control stick, you see what looks like a white line. So you'll see that in a MiG-21, MiG-23. We even saw it in the MiG-25 that Victor Belenko brought to Japan when he defected. That white line is there because the emergency procedure when you go into a spin is put the stick on the white line. And stick forward, stick pull forward. So that's how they said it. Interesting. But you know, you get what was supposedly the most modern Russian fighter, and they go and they look, and the first thing they see is a white line. Interesting. There's the F-86 cockpit. Both these pictures were taken at the National Museum, the USAF, up in Dayton, Ohio. And you can see, the cockpit layout. There's some similarities and some differences. The MiG-15, the pilot sits lower in the cockpit. It's harder to see over the nose. And if you talk to the guys at Jet Warbird Center down in Santa Fe, they'll tell you that it's a real bear to land. They handle the characteristics. You really have to have a good feel for it because it's very difficult to see over the nose. You're sitting lower in the cockpit. The F-86, much less of an issue. As you can see here, got great visibility and very comfortable. The size of the cockpits are about the same. Okay, let's talk about the pilots. The Air Force had very experienced pilots from World War II who generally led squadrons in flights. If they didn't have actual combat experience, they had a lot of jet experience because they'd been flying since the end of the war. The wingmen, however, most of them were inexperienced. So we think that all the pilots were experienced. Not all of them were, especially at the very beginning of the Korean War. But the inexperienced wingmen definitely benefited from having these combat veterans leading them, and the learning curve was much faster as a result. The Air Force also, to solve some of their inexperience problem, they used exchange pilots from friendly nations like Canada, England, and also from other services, the Navy and the Marine Corps. John Glenn was an exchange pilot flying the F-86 in Korea. And they did have one Navy ace in the F-86. The first Russian units that went into Korea, and we didn't know the Russians were doing this at the time until we started intercepting radio transmissions in 1951 that were in Russian. So we knew that Russian radar controllers were out there talking to pilots. And why wouldn't they be Russian pilots if speaking Russian? They had a rotation policy where they'd send an entire unit at a time. And they'd go over there for a year or so, and then they'd withdraw all of them. And a new unit would come in. That actually hurt them, because in the case around 1952, the inexperienced unit arrived and the veterans left. At the beginning of the war, though, we were fighting against experienced combat veterans from the Soviet Union from World War II who had as much as 300 hours of jet time. Pretty hefty competition. The Chinese pilots, they really didn't have an Air Force after the war that resulted in the People's Republic of China. So the Russians were trying to train them. And they pushed them through an accelerated program I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. that really hurt them. It was inadequate training. And the North Korean Air Force, not until 1953 did they even have combat pilots. They were ineffective. So the US, this is just an average of what a 1952 F-86 pilot went through in his training, and it was only men at the time. As we said, the flight leaders were experienced. We went through basic flight training in the T-6, just like they did in World War II for advanced training. You can see about 5 months there, 84 hours advanced training, which started in the T-6, but you also got the T-33, which is the training version of the F-80. And then finally the F-86. You graduate from pilot training with 265 hours, and then you go to Nellis for F-86 training. That's how we did it. And again, the experienced leadership really helped the learning curve on these young pilots. Also, they're in theater for a year, so the experience comes back and retrains the next group. So for the Russians, yes, the 303rd and 324th IEDs, they were great. The leader of the 324th IED was actually Colonel Ivan Kozadov, and if you may remember, 62 kills in World War II. Highly experienced guy running that show for the Russians. And we talked about after 52, the new unit that comes in, they lack experience, no combat experience, and very limited jet experience. Their basic training is about 150 hours in different versions of their equivalent of a T-6, and then they go into advanced training in the jets. The Chinese Air Force, there's a recruiting poster on the right, and on the left you have a defector that landed in Taiwan. Stalin ordered, he wanted to, remember this is the beginning of the Cold War, and the Russians didn't want to overtly show that they were involved in the war and escalate. And we also didn't want to escalate, but it was a UN action and so forth. Very confusing, and the first of its kind. But Stalin wanted the People's Liberation Army Air Force to take over the war and pull the Russians out of there, so there weren't any chances of any kind of an international incident. So he ordered them to speed up their training to 6 months, basically 6 months to get your wings instead of a year, and then we'd get training in Soviet tactics and Soviet aircraft. It was completely inadequate, and you see the miserable amount of flying time they had here. And it was also balanced between academic training, which was very difficult because of the language barrier, and then the limited flying. So they're very ineffective when they went out, very poorly trained. Of course, those who made it through and survived some combat missions were actually pretty good. All right, let's talk about the environment. And we really have to talk about this first jet versus jet thing. And it's kind of sobering to think that we're flying jets 2 years after the end of World War II, and now we're into a different environment. So the difference is in speed. And if you think about it, you are starting with a 20-mile setup. So 20 miles away. We close this distance from 20 miles in 1 minute to merge plot. Now these aircraft are very difficult to see nose on, very small amount of planform. So by the time you might be able to see a nose on jet, an F-86 or a MiG-15, 1 mile away, not unrealistic, the merge happens in 3 seconds. That's the difference in flying a jet versus flying a prop. Very, very different environment. And in addition to the speed and closure distances, the G-force is involved. The faster you go, the harder you have to pull G to turn. So American pilots have the advantage of, we had G suits. We actually had them at the end of World War II. The Russians, the Chinese, they did not have them. And that actually gives you about 2 to 3 G's worth of protection or prevention from rapid pitch change or a rapid onset of G. And some of these jets are capable of giving you G very fast. So if you didn't get a little ahead of it, or you didn't have an advantage with the G suit, you might be able to gray out and black out, and blood would pool at your feet, and then it'd take you a minute to come to. If your adversary sees that, your airplane's very predictable long enough for them to get a shot. So G-force is something else to deal with. At the speeds we're flying, more Gs. More Gs. 5G conversion, not unusual. The transonic region, now that we're flying it there, and the concept of critical Mach. So one of the things they found with the MiG-15 in the early testing was because of the design, as you approach the transonic region at about Mach 0.92, and the speed of sound varies with temperature, which means it varies with altitude due to the air density. A shock wave starts to form as you get towards the speed of sound. And the shock wave forms in different parts of the aircraft, but wherever it forms first, that's your critical Mach number. That's the speed at which you're still stable, the aircraft's still stable and flying. For the MiG-15, at 0.92, the tailplane had what they call a wave attachment. So this part of the aircraft is going supersonic. They tilted it back, they gave it some sweep to try and prevent that. But 0.92, the tailplane here was completely in the, basically in the wash. So this airplane had a tendency to violently pitch up at about 0.92. And they accepted that, and what they did, instead of, again, it's gonna sound familiar, instead of fixing that problem with the MiG-15, because it was going into production, at the beginning of the war they had 500 MiG-15s, we had about 150 F-86s, just comparison. They put a switch in so that when they hit 9.2, the speed brakes would deploy and slow the airplane down. That was their fix. And for the F-86, the critical Mach number we found was more like 0.96. So there's a definite advantage in terms of high-speed maneuverability. But critical Mach number, something we didn't have to think about, and us general aviation pilots, we don't think about on a day-to-day basis how our airplane's going to perform in the transonic region, but they had to think about it. The other thing they had to think about was the fuel burn. One of the things that you'll find transitioning from props to jets is it's unbelievable how quickly you go through gas. In fact, they changed the fuel gauge from measuring gallons to pounds. So the JP5, what they were flying with at the time, about 6.8 pounds per gallon. And just to give you an example, an F-86 returning to base had to have 600 pounds of fuel when they hit the base to be able to do their approach and landing and have enough to do another go-around if there was a problem. That was a requirement that we had for our F-86s coming back from combat in Korea. 600 pounds, that would last about 5 minutes, just to give you an idea. It's a different world in a jet, I'll tell you that. Okay, so the other parts of the environment. At the beginning of the war, as you probably know from history, surprised on 25 June 1950, the North Koreans come over the border. The Chinese and the Russians obviously know about it, and they come over the 38th parallel into South Korea to retake it. We are completely unprepared for that, and both the Republic of Korea and the US 8th Army are driven out all the way to the Pusan perimeter that you see in the left chart on the lower right. All the way down to there. And then General MacArthur, with his Incheon landing, high tide in April, gets behind them, and then it starts to become a rout. And the North Korean army is driven all the way past their original starting point, the 38th parallel, and all the way up to the Yalu River to the north. And we are right there on the border of China and North Korea at that point. Huge success. A war that people were somewhat ambivalent to. They're sort of like, let's get it. We were completely unprepared at the beginning of this. One of the biggest reasons why we drove them back is because of the presence of tactical air power. And we also flew a lot of B-29 sorties where we did saturation bombing of North Korea, trying to get bridges and rail lines and so forth. But, significant but, in the winter of 1950, things completely changed. And the Chinese said, if you cross the 38th parallel, we're going to commit our army to fight you. And it frankly was not taken seriously. And they did exactly that. They waited for winter, crossed the Yalu River with 12 divisions, and then again we were driven back south. Now, instead of being driven all the way to the Pusan perimeter, we were driven to that other red line where you see furthest southern. So Seoul, the capital of South Korea, was evacuated and retaken 4 times. And our first F-86s that went over there landed at Suwon and Kimpo in the north, and then they actually had to go back to Japan and then come back when we retook it. So there's a little bit of a lull in the fighting here. But that's the situation. And you can see the upper left corner of the right chart. That's the area we call MiG Alley. That's just south of the Chinese and North Korean border in that area near Sinuiju. And that's where a lot of the engagements occur later. Our primary bases are Kimpo and Suwon. You see the blue stars to the south there, and the initially Russians and then later Chinese and Russians and North Koreans are flying out of the Andong area. There were 2 large airfields up there. According to the UN rules, we could not cross that border. It was against the rules of engagement for UN aircraft to cross the border for any reason, because we didn't want to escalate the war. We didn't want this to become World War III. It was a limited war. It wasn't really limited for everybody, but it was for the US and the USSR. In this iconic picture, you see pilots walking out of Kimpo Air Base. MiG Alley, that area that we just looked at, is 200 miles away. This allowed, even with external tanks, F-86 pilots to have about 20 minutes on station. And obviously, if you're right over the border, flying a MiG-15, you have quite a bit more playtime, and you can pick and choose when you want to fight. And they actually were able to tell when the F-86s were getting at the limit of their range and had to go home, and that's a lot of times when they would attack. Again, we're going against Russian pilots, and they're very good. Here's a typical formation. Now we'll break into actual flying, the heart of the talk here. This is a typical US formation, so we call this Finger 4. This actually goes back to World War II. But you have a flight lead and an element lead. 4-ship flight lead, but it's broken into 2 elements, so you can maneuver as pairs. You have 2 wingmen there, and their job is to keep sight of their swept-wing aircraft, and they knew there were some of their buddies in the area, and we generally were outnumbered anytime the F-86s fought MiG-15, generally speaking, as many as 10 to 1. So he doesn't make an evasive maneuver in time, and Hinton is able to move in on number 2 man. He's a highly experienced Russian pilot, major, and he shoots him down. He rolls over and ejects, he survives, and then as the other MiGs see the remaining F-86 element, they hightail it and head over the border to China. First engagement, we shoot one down, no friendly losses, and we learn a couple of things. We learn that they can escape with that climbing Chandelle maneuver to get away and refuse to fight. We also find out that it took 1,200 rounds to shoot that MiG-15 down with a 50 caliber. Pretty much his whole load to shoot down one airplane. And an airplane that initially was not maneuvering. So we learned a couple of things on the very first mission. Anybody recognize that aircraft in the gun sight? Got 2 of them flying around. It's B-29. Okay, so early in the war, the MiGs become a serious threat to the bombing campaign using the B-29, and that's the gun camera film from a MiG-15 attacking a B-29 formation. On a raid over Sinuiju, during the daylight, we shot down 6 of them in April of 1951. MiG-15 shot down 6 B-29. Several others of them had to crash land and divert. It had a severe impact, and that was the last time we did a daylight mass formation bombing in North Korea. So the MiG-15 did an effective job of shutting it down, which is what they were there to do. The Russians that we flew against, I've talked about, they're good. They did have some aces, or at least based on claims. We'll talk about claims here in a minute. They were a little bit exaggerated in some cases. But Colonel E.G. Pepelev, 19, he claimed 14 F-86s shot down. Their top ace was Major Envy Sutyagin, who you see here in the upper right. And he claimed a total of 22 victories, 15 of them F-86s. They had some other aces. Well, during the war, they claimed they had a total of 52 aces. Now, this is not F-86s solely. It's B-29s, F-80s, F-84s, Corsairs, etc. But needless to say, they were good, and that changed in the beginning of 1952 when we got the less experienced units in theater. The Chinese, again, inadequate training. They did claim to have 7 aces. The first Chinese pilot to become ace was Zhao Baitong on the upper left there, claimed 7 victories. And on the right is Wang Hai, who claimed 9 victories, but that total's been revised down to about 2.5. Somewhat exaggerated. Remember a big PR campaign. Okay. I thought this was interesting. On March 14th, 1953, during what appeared to be a lull in the fighting, may have something to do with Stalin dying, but pardon me. We dropped these leaflets on North Korea, and basically they say, "Where's your Air Force?" Kind of taunting them, "Come up here and fight. Where are you guys?" But we dropped a bunch of these out there, and it seemed to work, because on the 26th of March, remember these were dropped earlier in March on the 14th, the highest number of MiG sightings in one day from UN pilots occurred. 289 MiGs were sighted, so maybe it worked. Okay, here's the US totals. Here's our aces in the order in which they occur. Remember 1953, that's only 7 months, so that's not even a full year. But you can see the loss of those Soviet pilots beginning in 1952, that really had an impact on the air war of the F-86 versus the MiG-15. The beginning of the war, it's almost a draw, because the Russians are shooting some of us down as well. However, we are prevailing overall. You can see some of these are triple aces and double aces. We'll talk a little bit about a few of the personalities here. Can't talk about all of them as much as I'd like to. But we did have a total of 40 aces. Jay Jabara. Okay, Jabby, he was the Air Force's first MiG ace, which occurred on the 20th of May, 1951. He went home and then he came back and became a triple ace. And that happened on 15th of July, 53, for timing-wise. He's an incredibly aggressive pilot, and unlike most fighter pilots, desirable trait, he didn't have very good eyesight. In fact, on one mission, he started shooting at another element of F-86s, thinking they were MiG-15s. He's like, "Jabby, it's us, back off," and he did. On the mission where he became an ace the first time, though, Jabby went into an engagement, and the Air Force was, of course, new service. We wanted the PR story. Remember, the war became very unpopular after the Chinese rolled south in the winter of 1950. But the Air Force had the desire to have an ace was going to be a big PR thing. So they started putting Jabby out front because he already had 3 kills and wanted to get a couple more and be the first ace. Send him home, be a big PR thing. And he knew it too, and he was up for it. Incredibly aggressive guy. They roll in on some MiGs, and the standard procedure is release your external tanks so that you have good maneuver, your best possible maneuverability. and one of Jabby's tanks didn't come off. And he went anyway. Normal procedure is, hey, abort. You don't have an advantage anymore. You can't maneuver effectively. But Jabby went in anyway, and was still able to get the shot with the help of some, good wingmen. And he wound up getting his 4th and 5th kill. But that's how aggressive he was. Now, revised total is that he may have damaged some of the aircraft instead of shooting them down, but let's not quibble about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he was our first. He later died in a car accident in 1961, unfortunately. George Davis. And both Jabby and George Davis here were some of the first aces in that period where we're fighting against probably the best MiG pilots during the war. So George Davis, he was the first ace in 2 wars. He became an ace in Korea on 30 November 51, and he was poised to become the top scorer in theater on 10 February 52. However, he was killed. He and his wingmen, they were protecting a flight of F-80s coming in to do some bombing, and they were close to bingo fuel, close to the fuel at which they had to recover and get back home. But MiGs were called in the area, and he and his wingmen, so there were only 2, decided to go out and engage. They engaged 10 MiGs with 2 aircraft. George Davis was able to shoot 2 of them down before he was himself shot. And there's still controversy as to whether a Chinese pilot or a Russian pilot shot him down. Both of them claimed victory, but it was sad. Medal of Honor winner for that mission. Pete Fernandez, interesting guy. So Pete joined the Army Air Corps during World War II, but they made him a flight instructor. He was a very good pilot, and they thought that was the best use for him. He stayed in the Air Force after the war. He went on to Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, and they made him a teacher again. He was going to be teaching gunnery. And as the war kicked off, he wanted to be involved, but he couldn't get an assignment over to the theater. So Pete decided, well, maybe I'll go on to a misbehavior campaign to get sent over there. So Pete would show up late for briefings. Sometimes he'd come in smelling a little bit like whiskey. And they said, hey, you got 2 choices. Well, he said, we got 2 choices. You can either court-martial me, embarrass everybody, or you can send me to Korea. So they sent him to Korea. He had a reputation as an excellent deflection shooter. So when you're directly behind somebody, you have a lot of time and you have a lot of stability to get your shot. You're in close. If he doesn't know you're there, it's even better, and you can put a lot of rounds. And with F-86, you have to put a lot of rounds into somebody. But Pete had a reputation of being an excellent deflection shooter. So with a lot of angle off, he could judge well enough to put the bullets out in front and get them raking right through the fuselage. He was an excellent shot. So Pete hits the theater, hits the ground running. He's with the 4th Fighter Wing. And in a 4-month period between 18 February and 16 May, he shoots down 14 and a half MiGs. Pretty awesome guy. And on the revalidation of claims, his claims held up. He also had 2 probables. And some of the other aces did not. Joe McConnell, originally from New Hampshire. He was our top ace with 16 victories. Between 14 January and 18 May, he was a student and close friend of Pete Fernandez, and they were both assigned to different fighter wings about the same time in Korea. They became aces within 2 days of each other, 16 Feb and 18 Feb. He had a reputation for excellent eyesight. You can see formations far enough away, and as you know, with the closure speeds that we have, that's a huge advantage. On the 12th of April 53, while he was pressing an attack, again outnumbered, another MiG was able to get in and get a shot on him, hit him in the fuselage. The particular pilot that did it was a 7 Victory Ace from the Soviet Air Force. And he thought he was done, and he went on to another target. Joe McConnell lag rolls, barrel rolls to his 6, and shoots him down. Great pilot. He managed to get his aircraft, even though it was hit, it was struggling, it was still flying. He was able to get it out over the water, and he was able to successfully eject. And he said his feet barely got wet before he was picked up, so it was very successful. Great pilot. Unfortunately, and here's a picture of Pete and Joe having a smoke before they went to get their Distinguished Service Crosses awarded by President Eisenhower. Now, this is taken from a still. It's a still from a movie shot from a 51st Fighter Wing public relations film. Notice something unusual about this MiG on the right, even though it's a little hard to see.
Flaps are down?
Gear and flaps are down. Yeah. So where is that MiG likely?
China.
China, exactly. Okay. Remember what the rules were. So now let's talk about Dolph Overton. So keeping the previous shot in mind, let's talk about the Air Force's quickest jet ace, Captain Dolph Overton. He previously flown the F-84 on a ground attack tour. He volunteered for a follow-on to Korea. And Dolph is short for dolphin, by the way, not Adolf. So he took a side trip to one of their radar sites, and he saw where the MiG formations were happening up in China, where they were assembling to go south and so forth. So on the 24th of 53, he became an ace. His kills were all in Manchuria in 4 days. Despite the UN mandate. The fact is, we had been going over that border for a while, and it's kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod thing at the time. We had one wing commander who briefed, there will be no flights into Manchuria, period. And then as he was about to walk out, he turned around and goes, and if you are up there, have enough sense to turn off your IFF. So it was tacitly encouraged. Francis Gabreski, who was a commander of the 51st Fighter Wing, he actually led missions into Manchuria. He called them Maple Specials because they were so sweet. Just a different time.
Yeah.
So, but unfortunately for Dolph, even though he's successful, he had a different wing commander than Gabreski. And they made an example of him. Because he flew in, they decided not to acknowledge his kills, to take his medals away, and he was sent home. Even though he was number 4 in the flight, he was blue 4. Nobody else was similarly disciplined or dressed. Nobody else suffered from anything else. This is 2009. Chief of Staff, Norton Schwartz at the time, Air Force Chief of Staff, they finally acknowledged his kills and gave him his medals. Only 56 years later. All right, let's talk about the results here. The initial claims, remember, PR time, new service, entering the war. Initial claims, 792 MiGs were lost versus 78 Sabres. 10-1 ratio, which is awesome. The Air Force itself did a study in 1970, a little bit after, called Sabre Measures Charlie, and that is how they spelled it at the time. They actually looked at World War II and Korea, and they looked at the loss rates for the amount of sorties. And they revised the totals to 3.6 to 1. They added some Sabres that were considered battle damaged, that were actually shot down. And they also reduced some of the claims because MiGs were only damaged. And my understanding is they looked at a lot of the gun camera film to be able to determine this, that unfortunately I couldn't get to work. Mm-hmm. And they were able to see that that wasn't a kill. Remember, it took a lot of rounds to bring a MiG-15 down. There was a further study done by RAND in 2008, which covered a lot of ground, but it reviewed the Korea record. And they reduced the total to 1.8 to 1 overall, still in favor of US pilots. They said it was as low as 1.3 to 1 with the Russian pilots at the beginning of the war. So here's a postscript. We came up in 27th of April. This leaflet was dropped, another one. Psychological warfare sort of picked up during the Korean War. A lot of interesting things. But we dropped these leaflets saying that if you fly your MiG-15 south, we'll give you $100,000 and exile and a good life. None of the North Korean pilots took advantage of that, and the guy you see in the lower left in the leaflet is Francis Jarecki, who had actually flown shortly before that his MiG-15 from Poland to Denmark in March of '53. So they were saying, hey, you can have what this guy had if you take advantage of it. But they didn't during the war. But after the war, September 21st, '53, Lieutenant No Kum-sok defected from North Korea. He actually flew from Pyongyang down to Kimpo Air Base. And he was a little scared. He goes, are they going to shoot me down? How am I going to get there? It was about a 20-minute flight. So he entered the traffic pattern from the opposite direction. He actually landed with an F-86 going the other direction and cleared the runway. He came in and defected. They were able to get his, so obviously, and he came to the US, changed his name to Kenneth Rowe, lived in Florida. He unfortunately passed away in 2022, but he became an aeronautical engineer. He was able to get his mother into the country, and his mother set him up with a nice wife, and he had a good life. Here's the airplane that he brought back. We flew it, it was disassembled and reassembled. They took it to Okinawa, and it was test flown by a number of test pilots, including Chuck Yeager. Chuck Yeager didn't have a very high opinion of it. And remember, .92 is when we had that violent pitch up with the MiG-15. He flew it to .98 trying to see if it would go supersonic. And it became very unstable. He said, this thing's a piece of crap. But he appreciated its performance at high altitude, its rapid rate of climb, all the things that Sabre pilots have been talking about for 3 years. So the legacy, when you think about it, at the time of the first jet combat, it had only been 32 years since the end of World War I, the first war where we had air-to-air combat. That's rapid technological change to be able to get there. And it was only 2 years from the end of World War II when we had no operational jet fighter until we had 2 second-generation fighters, 2 excellent ones, in MiG-15 and the F-86. So, pretty amazing amount of technology in a short period of time. The other thing is, the Russians, the Soviets have long been our adversary, and they're our competitor in the world today. We've had brief times when we were friendly, but we've never directly fought them. But we did in Korea. We did fight them, and we beat them, as well as the Chinese, who of course we fought on the ground, but we fought them in the air, and we beat them as well. Not insignificant. Korea was our first limited war. It was an innovative period for a lot of things. Combat search and rescue really came into its own. Some of our helicopter pilots really put their life on the line to rescue some of our guys behind enemy lines. First use of radar intercepts within the aircraft for jets. Electronic countermeasures, psychological warfare, all that stuff happened. But really, this period of limited warfare with these rules of engagement that didn't really work for our pilots and put us at a disadvantage, our pilots directly challenged those. And Dolph Overton, unfortunately, was a scapegoat for a lot of the overflights and so forth. But hopefully it was going to make us smarter about the rules of engagement that we came into. Not exactly. While I think we are much better, and we've seen that in some of the more recent conflicts in terms of how we limit the ability of our pilots to fly tactically effectively, we didn't do that in Vietnam. And we suffered for that as well. Our first limited war, it's often called the Forgotten War because a lot of people wanted to put it aside, and unfortunately we could have learned a lot of things from it, in my opinion, and still can. North Koreans will never forget their country was basically turned into rubble by the U.S. Air Force in the Allied bombing campaign. Every target of any significance was gone within the first 3 months. We kept rebombing bridges and things like that. But that's one of the things that people still remember. And it was very devastating for both the North Koreans and South Koreans. Now, North Koreans started it, but even in South Korea, I've had 2 tours over there with the Air Force. And on my first one back in the 80s, I saw what looked like a game show on late night television, Korean television. And its people were holding up signs and they had dates on them, like 20 December 1950. They're still trying to find each other after all those years, the end of the war. So, pretty significant. All right. So, that's our summary and brief. I'm sorry the film didn't work, but I think we have some time for some questions here. Yes, sir.
Kinchlow, is he the same Kinchlow that was the F-104 test pilot?
He was. Yes. Yeah, he was an ace in Korea.
And is it true that the character Kinch in Hogan's Heroes was an homage to Kinchlow?
I don't know.
I was
That's
told
interesting.
that by someone we were with.
Yeah.
He was from Wajax, Michigan, and they made references about Michigan in an episode of Hogan's Heroes. So.
Interesting. I
He
didn't know that.
was Caucasian, correct? The real Kinchlow?
Yes. Interesting. Yeah, Ivan Kinchlow, the famous test pilot, he was an ace in Korea, a very effective young lieutenant wingman that became an ace. Yes, sir.
You didn't mention the P1101 as a basis for the MiG-15. I thought it would be interesting to talk about, how they could sweep the wing at different angles and how they studied basically 32 degrees angles versus 45, because the MiG-15 is 33, I believe, and they had to solve a lot of aerodynamical problems induced by this angle, which is also a big factor of the design of the wing and the fins on the MiG-15 that is not something on the MiG F-86.
Yes, very, very good observations. Now, the MiG-15, of course, there were compromises. One of the things they had with that high tail was that it became more unstable as it got to critical Mach. The F-86 had what we call an all-flying tail. So if you've ever flown a Piper, a Mooney, where the whole horizontal stabilizer moves, the stabilator, that's the way the F-86 went after 1951. It was highly effective in a high-speed, high-G environment. MiG-15 still had regular horizontal stabilizer further out with conventional elevators. And also the controls were not hydraulically boosted. Regarding the German design, there was actually a paper presented in 1935 by a German engineer at an international aerodynamics conference where he said, if we sweep the wings 35 degrees, we can achieve supersonic flight. And he was pretty much ignored. But that's how advanced the Germans were versus the rest of us. And they're because internally they were listening to that. And we were not. Thank you.